The term Chinese debt trap is heard often. It suggests China lends money to African nations. The goal, some say, is to make them owe too much. Then, China can supposedly seize important assets. This idea has spread widely in recent years. It paints a picture of China as a predatory lender. Many news reports and politicians discuss this. This essay will explore this accusation closely. We will look at the facts and the stories. Understanding this is key to Africa-China relations. This narrative often surfaces during global discussions. It is particularly prominent in Western countries. The concern is about China's growing influence. Africa is a continent with vast potential. It also has significant development needs. China has become a major financial partner here. This partnership is viewed with suspicion by some. They worry about the terms of Chinese loans. They fear negative outcomes for African sovereignty. We must examine these fears with care. The debt trap idea implies a deliberate strategy. It suggests China plans to ensnare countries. This is a serious charge against any nation. It affects how African leaders make decisions. It also influences international diplomacy. Is this accusation based on solid proof? Or is it a misunderstanding or misinformation? This question is very important for global development. It impacts how we see China's role in the world. Let's delve deeper into this complex issue. Understanding this concept requires looking at motives. Why would China want to trap nations in debt? Some argue it is for geopolitical leverage. Others point to gaining control of natural resources or securing strategic locations for ports or bases. These are powerful claims to consider. However, we need to ask if the evidence supports them. This essay aims to provide clarity. It will use research and data to help readers form their own informed opinions. The debt trap theory rests on several core claims. First, critics say China targets vulnerable countries. These are often nations with poor economies, or those with weak governance structures. The argument is that China exploits this weakness. It offers loans that seem attractive initially, but these loans allegedly have hidden dangers. These dangers lead to unsustainable debt burdens. This is a central pillar of the theory. Making countries dependent is the supposed aim. Second, the theory claims Chinese loans lack transparency. Loan terms are often not publicly disclosed. This secrecy makes it hard to assess the risks. It can also hide unfavorable conditions. Critics suggest this opacity is intentional. It allows China to impose harsh terms. If a country defaults, China might demand assets. This could include ports, railways, or mines. The Hambantota port in Sri Lanka is often cited. Though many details of that case are debated, a third argument involves the viability of projects. Accusers state China funds white elephant projects. These are large infrastructure projects. They may not be economically sound or profitable. Examples include new airports with few flights, or highways that do not carry much traffic. If projects fail, countries cannot repay loans. This, again, leads to increased debt and potential asset seizure, the theory goes. This questions the quality of Chinese investment. Finally, there is the claim of asset seizure. This is perhaps the most alarming part of the theory. It suggests China uses debt as a weapon. When a country cannot pay, China takes control. Strategic assets are the supposed targets. This would give China significant power. It could reshape global trade and security. This fear of losing sovereignty is powerful. It drives much of the debt trap discourse. We must check if these seizures actually happen. When we look at the evidence, the picture is complex. Researchers have studied Chinese lending extensively. My own work has focused on this for many years. The claim that China intentionally traps nations is not strongly supported by facts. Most Chinese loans are for infrastructure. These projects are often requested by African governments. They address real development needs like roads and power. This does not mean all projects are perfect, but the intent to trap is difficult to prove. Many studies find no evidence of systematic asset seizures. Let's consider the data on debt sustainability. African debt has risen, this is true. However, China is not the largest creditor for many African nations. Private bondholders and multilateral institutions often hold more debt. For example, the World Bank and IMF are major lenders. So are commercial creditors from Western countries. Focusing only on China can be misleading. It simplifies a much broader debt situation. Debt relief and restructuring are common with Chinese loans. This is not consistent with a purely predatory model. The Hambantota port in Sri Lanka is a key example used. However, the story is more nuanced than often told. Sri Lanka's debt problems were not solely due to China. It had large debts to many other creditors. The port was leased to a Chinese company. This was not a direct seizure for debt. It was a commercial agreement to manage the underperforming port and to attract investment into an economic zone. No other country has lost a major asset to China due to debt. This singular, complex case is often oversimplified. Research also shows China has engaged in debt restructuring. It has cancelled some debts for poorer countries. It participates in G20 debt relief initiatives. This behavior is more like a traditional lender, not like a lender trying to seize assets. While transparency can be improved, this is changing. More loan details are becoming available. African governments also have agency. They negotiate these loan agreements. It is not a one-sided imposition of terms. Chinese loans in Africa take various forms. They are not all the same. Some are interest-free loans from the Chinese government. These are often for smaller projects or humanitarian aid. Then there are concessional loans. These are provided by China Exim Bank or China Development Bank. They have lower interest rates and longer repayment periods. These often fund large infrastructure projects, like railways, ports, and power dams. These aim to support economic development. Another type is commercial loans. These have terms closer to market rates. Chinese banks provide these for profitable ventures. Sometimes loans are resource-backed. This means repayment is linked to future commodity exports. Angola is a well-known example of this model. It used future oil shipments to secure loans for rebuilding. This model helped Angola after its civil war. It allowed access to finance when others were unwilling. However, it also carries risks if commodity prices fall. Let's look at Ethiopia. China has funded significant infrastructure there. The Addis Ababa-Djibouti Railway is a major project. It connects landlocked Ethiopia to the sea. This railway is vital for Ethiopia's trade. The loans for this project are substantial. Ethiopia has faced debt challenges, but China has worked with Ethiopia to restructure some of this debt. This involved extending repayment periods. It shows a willingness to negotiate, not just seize. In Kenya, China funded parts of the Standard Gauge Railway, or SGR. The SGR connects Mombasa Port to Nairobi and beyond. This project has been controversial. There were debates about its cost and economic viability. Kenya took on significant loans for the SGR. Concerns about debt sustainability have been raised. However, Kenya continues to manage its debt obligations. There has been no seizure of assets like the Mombasa port. African governments are active in these negotiations. They weigh the benefits against the costs and risks. So Western media plays a significant role, It shapes how the so-called debt trap is understood globally. And, well, many prominent media outlets are based in the West, right? Their reporting reaches a wide audience. The narrative of a Chinese debt trap has been very common, honestly. It often features in headlines and news analysis, which creates a strong impression on public opinion. It also influences policymakers in Western capitals, and sometimes even in African countries themselves. The repetition of this narrative makes it seem like an established fact. However, this media coverage is not always balanced. Sometimes it relies on limited evidence, or it highlights worst-case scenarios that have not actually materialized. The focus is often on the potential dangers of Chinese loans, while less attention may be given to the benefits, or to Africa's own agency in these deals. The narrative can fit into broader geopolitical rivalries. China's rise is viewed as a challenge by some Western powers, and criticizing Chinese lending can be part of this competition. This context is, honestly, really important for understanding media framing. Some research suggests a pattern of misinformation. Stories about asset seizures, for example, have been debunked, yet they continue to circulate. Once a narrative is established, it's hard to change. Journalists may face pressure to produce compelling stories, and a debt trap makes for a dramatic headline. It's definitely more sensational than a nuanced story about infrastructure finance. This can lead to oversimplification of complex issues, and it can also lead to a lack of critical engagement with the facts on the ground. It is important to seek diverse sources of information. Not all Western media coverage is the same, of course. Some journalists and outlets do provide deeper analysis. They question the dominant narrative and include African voices and perspectives. However, the overall trend has often favored the debt trap story. This has real-world consequences. It can affect trust between Africa and China and it can also limit Africa's financing options if one major partner is unfairly demonized. It is crucial to listen to African perspectives. African leaders and experts have diverse views, and they're definitely not a single unified voice. However, many have challenged the debt trap narrative. They see China as an important development partner, one that offers alternatives to traditional lenders. Many African leaders appreciate the speed of Chinese projects and China's willingness to fund large infrastructure, which Western partners were sometimes hesitant to support. This has been a common theme across the continent. For example, leaders like Rwandan President Paul Kagame have spoken about Africa's agency. He emphasizes that African countries make their own choices. They are not simply victims of foreign powers. Other leaders have also welcomed Chinese investment, and they point to the tangible benefits in their countries: new roads, railways, and power plants. These are seen as essential for economic growth. They often state that loan terms are negotiated and that they are careful about debt sustainability. African scholars and economists also offer insights. Many have conducted research on Chinese engagement, and their findings often contradict the simplistic debt trap idea. They point to the complexities of the relationships and highlight both opportunities and challenges. For instance, experts at the African Development Bank or independent think tanks across Africa, they analyze debt data carefully. They often conclude that while debt is a concern, China is not uniquely responsible for it. Of course, there are also critical voices in Africa. Some academics and civil society groups raise concerns. They worry about debt levels and project quality, and call for more transparency and accountability. These are valid concerns that need to be addressed. However, this is different from the debt trap theory, which implies a deliberate malicious intent by China. Most African critiques focus on improving the partnership, not on ending it due to a perceived trap. Their input is vital for responsible borrowing. Beyond the debate about debt, there are clear benefits. Chinese investment has brought tangible changes to Africa. The most visible is in infrastructure development. For decades, Africa faced a huge infrastructure gap. Roads, railways, ports, and power systems were lacking. This really hampered economic growth and integration. Chinese companies and finance have helped fill this gap. They've built thousands of kilometers of roads and railways, constructed new airports and seaports, and significantly increased power generation capacity. These infrastructure projects have direct economic impacts. New roads reduce transport costs for businesses and connect farmers to markets. Reliable power supports industries and households, while improved ports facilitate international trade. These are just essential foundations for economic transformation. For example, the Loandjili Point Noir Road in Congo-Brazzaville or the Karuma hydropower plant in Uganda. These projects contribute to daily life and commerce, and their long-term value is often significant. Chinese investment also creates jobs. During construction, many local workers are employed, and there's also job creation in related industries. Skills transfer is another potential benefit. African workers and engineers can learn new techniques by working on Chinese projects. While there are debates about the extent of local hiring and the quality of jobs created, the overall impact on employment is often positive. This is particularly important in countries with young populations. Furthermore, Chinese engagement has increased competition. It has provided African countries with more options. Previously, they relied mainly on Western donors and institutions, which often came with policy conditions. China's approach has generally been less prescriptive, focusing on infrastructure rather than governance reforms. This has given African governments more policy space, and it has also spurred other international partners to re-engage with Africa and offer competitive terms. This broader choice is definitely beneficial for the continent. It is essential to place Chinese lending in context. Africa's debt is not solely or even primarily owed to China. The continent's total public debt involves many creditors, including multilateral institutions like the World Bank and IMF, the Paris Club of official creditors, mostly Western nations, and increasingly, private commercial creditors. These are bondholders and commercial banks. In fact, for many African countries, private creditors hold the largest share of external debt. Their lending terms are often less concessional than Chinese loans, and restructuring debt with diverse private bondholders can be very complex. Focusing narrowly on China distorts the real picture. It can lead to misdiagnosing the causes of debt distress and therefore to ineffective solutions. African debt levels rose significantly after the 2008 financial crisis, and again due to the COVID-19 pandemic and global economic shocks. Commodity price volatility also plays a major role. Many African economies depend on raw material exports. When prices fall, government revenues decline. This makes it harder to service all debts, not just Chinese ones. These broader factors are crucial to understanding Africa's debt. African governments themselves have agency. They are not passive recipients of loans. They actively seek finance for their development plans, negotiate terms with various lenders, and make choices based on their national interests. Sometimes these choices involve taking on debt. The responsibility for managing debt lies with these governments as well as with the lenders. Good governance and debt management capacity are key. Blaming one external actor oversimplifies this shared responsibility. Moreover, the nature of debt is changing. The rise of private creditors means more complex debt workouts. When countries face difficulties, all creditors need to cooperate. China has shown willingness to participate in multilateral debt relief, such as the G20's Debt Service Suspension Initiative and the Common Framework for Debt Treatments. Its engagement in these processes is evolving, reflecting a more integrated approach to addressing sovereign debt challenges globally. This cooperation is vital for sustainable solutions. The Chinese debt trap narrative is powerful. It has shaped much of the discussion about China in Africa. However, as we have seen, it is a simplification. It does not fully align with the available evidence. Research suggests China is not systematically trapping countries. There is no widespread seizure of African assets by China. Instead, Chinese lending is part of a complex financial landscape. It offers both opportunities and risks for African nations. Like any form of borrowing, it requires careful management, but it is not inherently predatory. It is time to move beyond this myth. We need a more nuanced and fact-based understanding. This means looking at data from diverse sources, and it means listening to African voices and perspectives. African leaders and citizens are best placed to assess their partnerships. They are actively shaping their continent's future. They make choices about who to borrow from and for what purpose. Their agency should be at the center of any analysis. Reducing them to victims of a foreign power is unhelpful and often inaccurate. Chinese investment has brought real benefits to Africa. Infrastructure development is the most visible. Roads, railways, ports, and power plants have been built. These projects address critical development needs. They can support economic growth and improve lives. This does not mean there are no challenges. Concerns about debt sustainability are real. Project quality and transparency can be improved. These are areas for ongoing dialogue and reform between African countries and all their partners, including China. Ultimately, we must question simplistic narratives, especially those driven by geopolitical competition. The reality of China-Africa relations is multifaceted. It involves economic, political, and social dimensions, and it's constantly evolving. Readers should seek out balanced information, consider the evidence from researchers and experts, and look at the situation from an African viewpoint. Only then can we have a truly informed discussion about China's role in Africa and its impact on global development.